You ever have one of those mornings where you just know trouble is waiting outside your door? That was me. Except I didn't expect my quiet lakeside retreat to turn into the middle of a circus. Imagine waking up to Karen screaming into her phone like she was reporting a terrorist attack, and then barging into my place as if she owned it, ordering her workers to shove 100 guests' belongings into my cabinets. Yeah, definitely not the kind of peaceful morning I had planned. Watching her obnoxious behavior turn the entire neighborhood upside down was enough to make my blood boil. But truth be told, that was also the exact moment I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to throw a tantrum. That would have been too easy for her. Instead, I decided to play it smart, to take an approach that would knock the smug grin off her face and leave her completely speechless. And let me just say, the move I had in mind wouldn't only silence Karen, it would also give the entire neighborhood a front-row seat to some long-overdue satisfaction. You want to know how it all went down? Stick with me. The day started the way nightmares usually do, suddenly and way too loud. At 6 a.m. sharp, the roar of engines, clanging metal, and shouting voices jolted me out of bed. For a second, I thought a construction crew had decided to set up camp in my yard. I'm Jack Morrison, by the way. For the last 3 years, I've been living in a custom-built cabin by Lake Meridian. After serving 15 years as a military audio engineer, my career was cut short by betrayal. My commanding officer, Colonel Davidson, decided to protect his reputation by throwing me under the bus. That chapter ended ugly, so I left it all behind. Instead of chasing promotions or rubbing shoulders with power-hungry idiots, I chose silence and peace. My cabin isn't just a home. It's my sanctuary, a personal audio lab where I freelance for Hollywood studios and even take on hush-hush projects for government agencies. But the one thing that matters most to me is quiet. Dead quiet. So when diesel engines shattered that peace, I knew right away something, or someone, was about to ruin my day. Rubbing sleep from my eyes, I grabbed my mug of coffee and looked through my reinforced window. What I saw made the mug slip right out of my hand and smash on the floor. My peaceful lakeside property had been transformed overnight into what looked like the launch of a high-tech expo. Huge trucks were unloading gear worth more than most people's houses. Varjo Aero VR headsets, Vicon tracking systems, holographic projectors, even a massive outdoor theater screen. This wasn't a barbecue gone out of control. This was a professional operation. And right in the middle of it all, barking orders like she was queen of the world, stood none other than Karen Mitchell, our so-called neighborhood watchdog, former HOA president, and all-around nightmare. For the last year, Karen had been making life miserable for everyone with her twisted interpretation of community rules. She fined old Mrs. Smith $500 for planting sunflowers, forced the Wilsons to repaint their cheerful yellow home because it didn't fit the aesthetic. And now here she was, treating my sanctuary like her personal business venture. I threw on clothes and stepped outside, instantly regretting not grabbing my noise-canceling headphones. Up close, the chaos was worse. Dozens of workers in matching polos were setting up what looked like a luxury wilderness camp. Designer couches, fire pits, and a giant banner that read, Nexus Wilderness VR, Premium Nature Immersion Experience. The price tag? $50,000 per guest. 50 grand. To sit in my backyard and pretend they were experiencing nature. The irony was so sharp you could have sliced it with a chainsaw. Excuse me? I called, my voice cutting through the commotion. Karen turned, plastering on that politician's smile that never touched her eyes. Oh, Jack, good morning. I hope we didn't wake you. Didn't wake me? She had half the county awake. She waved an official-looking document in my face. This is a very exciting day for our community. I have full authorization from the HOA for this premium corporate event. We're hosting 100 VIP guests for an exclusive wilderness VR experience. Your property has been designated as the reception and check-in area. The way she said it, like she was doing me a favor, made my stomach twist. I reached for the paper, but she yanked it back before I could get a good look. Something about it felt off, but she wasn't about to let me find out. Now, normally, confrontation isn't my thing. After Davidson destroyed my career, I learned. The system doesn't always punish the guilty. Sometimes it protects them. That experience left me wary of direct fights. But standing there, watching strangers stomp all over my land while Karen smirked like she owned it, I felt that old knot in my stomach. The same one I'd felt before Davidson's betrayal. Only this time I wasn't going to roll over. Karen, I don't remember giving permission for any of this, I said firmly. This is private property. Her fake smile cracked. Jack, honey, this event is bringing in over $2 million of revenue for our community. You can't just shut it down because you're feeling antisocial. Behind her, her crew kept building, setting up cameras, running cables, arranging furniture worth more than my truck. They weren't weekend volunteers. These were professionals. And they were acting like they'd rented my backyard for the month. I need to see that authorization, I pressed, reaching again. She clutched it to her chest. You don't need to see official HOA documents. Cooperate, or I'll have to make this a legal matter. Her voice dropped, sharp and threatening. In fact, if you keep interfering, I'll call the authorities. That's when it clicked. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought I was just some quiet guy in a cabin. What she didn't realize was that my entire property was wired with top-grade surveillance equipment. Every word she said, every order she barked, it was all being recorded in crystal-clear digital audio. You know what, Karen? I said, with a calmness that made her blink. Go ahead. Call. The cops. That's an excellent idea. The confidence in my tone caught her off guard, but she recovered fast. Don't test me, Jack. I have more authority in this community than you realize. Except while she was puffing herself up, I was cataloging every detail, her words, her lies, her setup, and all of it was backed by recordings that could make her life very complicated. That's when Karen actually did it. She pulled out her phone with a dramatic flair that belonged in a Hollywood movie. Yes, 911, I need the police immediately, she shouted, loud enough for the neighborhood to hear. I have a disturbed former military man threatening a legal business event with 100 VIP guests. He appears unstable and is interfering with our corporate function. The way she emphasized former military and unstable made it clear what game she was playing. She wasn't just being her usual manipulative self, she was weaponizing the system against me. While she gave her Oscar-worthy performance, I scanned the so-called guests arriving. These weren't locals. They were stepping out of Teslas and Porsches, wearing suits that cost more than rent, flaunting watches worth a small business, and some even had bodyguards trailing behind them. These weren't just wealthy people. They were ridiculously wealthy. The kind who toss 50 grand like it's lunch money just because someone whispered exclusive and limited. And from what I overheard, they weren't here for fresh air. They were here for buzzwords, metaverse investments, blockchain, wilderness retreats, AI-powered nature immersion. One man in a sharp-tailored suit leaned toward his friend and said with a grin, "This is the future of luxury experiences combining cutting-edge VR technology with authentic wilderness settings." Another woman was live streaming on what looked like a diamond-encrusted phone, telling her followers about this amazing breakthrough in environmental gaming. The disconnect between their tech-obsessed excitement and the fact that they were standing in my actual backyard was almost surreal. But here's where things got really interesting. Karen's crew wasn't just setting up in the general area anymore. They were actively moving equipment, furniture, and what looked like expensive guest belongings directly onto my property. We're talking about a full VIP reception area, complete with a check-in desk, luxury seating arrangements, and a massive banner that read, "Nexus Wilderness VAR Premium Nature Immersion Experience," stretched right across my front yard. When I approached one of the workers to ask what he thought he was doing, Karen appeared like some sort of property rights violating superhero. "This is the designated rustic reception zone," Karen announced, gesturing toward my cabin like she was showing off a vacation rental. The HOA has approved this entire area for community use during special events. She said it with such authority that I almost questioned my own property ownership for a second. Almost. Karen, this is literally my private property. You can't just declare it a community space because you feel like it. But she just waved that mysterious document again, keeping it just far enough away that I couldn't read the fine print. Everything here is perfectly legal and properly documented. You're just going to have to trust the process. Trust the process. That phrase sent a chill down my spine because it was exactly what Colonel Davidson used to say right before he screwed someone over. The same dismissive tone, the same implied authority, the same suggestion. That questioning anything made you the problem. I could feel that familiar anger building in my chest. The same feeling that had gotten me in trouble when I tried to expose Davidson's corruption. The difference was, back then, I'd let my emotions get the better of me and played right into his hands. This time I was going to be smarter about it. Instead of losing my temper, I quietly made my way back toward my cabin. Not to retreat, mind you, but to activate something Karen had no idea existed. See, when you design audio surveillance equipment for military and intelligence operations, you tend to install the good stuff in your own home. My cabin isn't just a quiet retreat. It's essentially a sophisticated listening post equipped with parabolic microphones, directional recording equipment, and sound isolation technology that can pick up conversations from hundreds of feet away. The system runs continuously in the background, automatically filtering and recording anything that exceeds normal ambient sound levels. As I reached my front door, I heard the unmistakable sound of police sirens getting closer. Karen's theatrical 911 call had worked. And now, I was about to have some very interesting explaining to do to law enforcement. But here's the thing about being prepared. When someone threatens to bring the authorities into your business, it helps to have authorities level documentation of everything that's happening. While Karen had been busy orchestrating her invasion and making her dramatic phone calls, my recording equipment had been dutifully capturing every word, every threat, and every admission she'd made. "I hope you're ready to explain yourself to the police," Karen called out with obvious satisfaction. As the sirens grew louder, "They don't take kindly to people who interfere with legitimate business operations." She was standing there surrounded by her crew, her expensive guests, and what looked like several thousand worth of equipment that had somehow found its way onto my property, acting like she was the victim in this situation. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. What Karen didn't know was that she'd just given me everything I needed to turn this entire situation completely upside down. The game was about to change, and I had a feeling she wasn't going to like the new rules. The two officers who stepped out of the patrol car looked like they'd already made up their minds about who the problem was before they'd even heard the story. Officer Johnson, a tall guy with the kind of mustache that screamed 20 years on the force, and Officer Williams, younger but with that rookie eagerness to prove himself, both walked straight toward Karen like she was hosting a charity fundraiser, instead of running an unauthorized commercial operation on my property. Karen immediately launched into her victim routine, complete with hand gestures and the kind of breathless urgency that suggested I was some sort of dangerous fugitive. "Thank God you're here, officers. This man has been threatening me and trying to sabotage a legitimate business event that's bringing significant economic benefit to our community. I'm honestly concerned about his mental state given his military background." The way she emphasized military background like it was code for ticking time bomb told me everything I needed to know about the narrative she'd been spinning. "Officer." Johnson turned toward me with the kind of measured suspicion that cops develop after dealing with too many domestic disputes and property line arguments. "Sir, we received a report that you've been interfering with a permitted community event and making threats. Can you tell us your side of what's happening here?" The fact that he phrased it as your side rather than asking what was actually going on told me that Karen's 911 performance had been more effective than I'd hoped. But here's the thing about being trained in military intelligence. You learn to stay calm under pressure, and you learn to present information in a way that makes people take you seriously. I reached into my wallet and pulled out 2 pieces of identification that I knew would shift the entire dynamic of this conversation. The first was my standard driver's license. Nothing special about that. The second was my Department of Defense contractor identification card, the kind with the special holographic security features and the clearance level indicators that make law enforcement officers pay attention. I'm Jack Morrison, and I'm a government contractor specializing in acoustic surveillance technology. This cabin is actually a certified research facility where I conduct classified audio analysis for various federal agencies. The change in Officer Johnson's demeanor was immediate and obvious. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he looked at the ID card with the kind of recognition that told me he'd seen similar credentials before. Mr. Morrison, can you explain what's happening with this event? Notice how it went from Sir to Mr. Morrison, and from your side to asking me to explain the situation. That little piece of plastic had just leveled the playing field considerably. Officer Williams was now looking around my property with new eyes, probably wondering how a community event had ended up at what was, apparently, a government research facility. Officers, I woke up this morning to find that Miss Mitchell had set up what appears to be an unauthorized commercial operation on my private property, I explained, gesturing toward the chaos surrounding us. She claims to have HOA authorization, but when I asked to examine the documentation, she refused to let me see it properly. This facility requires complete acoustic isolation for the work you do, and having 100 people and amplified equipment here creates significant security and operational concerns. I kept my voice level and professional, the same tone I used to use when briefing commanding officers about surveillance operations. Karen, who had been looking increasingly uncomfortable as the officer's attention shifted toward me, decided this was the moment to play her trump card. I don't care what kind of identification he has. I have proper authorization from the HOA board for this event. This is a legitimate business operation that's bringing $2 million in revenue to our community. She waved that mysterious document again, but this time Officer Johnson held out his hand expectantly. Ma'am, we're going to need to see that authorization. The look of panic that flashed across Karen's face lasted for maybe half a second, but I caught it. And more importantly, so did Officer Williams. She fumbled with the papers for a moment before handing them over, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Officer Johnson examined the document for what felt like forever, before looking up with an expression that suggested he'd found something interesting. Miss Mitchell, this appears to be a standard HOA meeting minutes document, not an authorization for commercial events. And according to this, the vote mentioned here was actually defeated, not approved. That's impossible, Karen sputtered, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I am the HOA president, and I have full authority to approve community events that benefit our neighborhood. Officer Johnson handed the document back to her with the kind of patience that suggested he'd dealt with similar situations before. Ma'am, even if you are the HOA president, which we'll need to verify, HOA boards typically cannot authorize commercial use of private property without the owner's consent. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, and I knew I needed to play it perfectly. Instead of gloating or getting aggressive, I looked directly at both officers and made what I hoped would sound like a reasonable request. Officers, I think there might be some confusion here about what's actually happening. Would it be possible for you to come inside for a few minutes? I have some audio documentation that might help clarify the situation. The word audio documentation got their attention immediately, especially given my stated profession and security clearance. Karen's eyes went wide, and for the first time since this whole circus began, she looked genuinely worried. You don't need to go in there. This is clearly just an attempt to waste your time and avoid taking responsibility for his threatening behavior. But Officer Johnson was already looking toward my cabin with professional interest. Mr. Morrison, what kind of audio documentation are we talking about? The kind that runs continuously as part of my security protocol for classified work, I replied, letting that sink in for a moment. Everything that's happened here this morning has been automatically recorded by systems designed for federal law enforcement applications. High-quality, legally admissible documentation of every conversation, every threat, and every claim that's been made. I could see Karen's face getting paler by the second as she realized what I was implying. Officers, I think you'll find the recordings quite illuminating when it comes to understanding what's really been going on here. Officer Williams looked at his partner, then back at me, then over at Karen, who was now looking like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Sir, we'd definitely be interested in hearing that documentation. Leading the officers into my cabin was like watching their perception of reality shift in real time. What they'd probably expected to find was a typical lakeside retreat with maybe some basic recording equipment. What they actually walked into was something that looked like it belonged in a federal surveillance facility. The main room housed a sophisticated audio analysis setup with multiple computer monitors displaying real-time sound wave patterns, directional microphone arrays that could isolate conversations from hundreds of feet away, and recording equipment that most police departments could only dream of having in their budgets. Officer Williams let out a low whistle as he took in the wall of professional-grade electronics, while Officer Johnson nodded with the appreciation of someone who'd seen similar setups in government facilities. "This is impressive," Mr. Morrison, Officer Johnson said, examining the parabolic microphone setup that was currently pointing toward my front yard. "How exactly does this system work?" I was happy to explain, partly because I was proud of the technology I developed and partly because I wanted them to understand just how sophisticated and legally sound my documentation was going to be. The system uses AI-powered audio separation technology, originally designed for military intelligence operations. It can isolate individual conversations from background noise, analyze voice stress patterns to detect deception, and create court-admissible recordings with timestamp authentication that meets federal evidence standards. The beauty of the system was that it wasn't just recording everything like some basic security camera setup. The AI component could actually focus on specific voices, filter out ambient noise, and even detect when someone was lying based on micro changes in vocal stress patterns. When you're dealing with classified information and need to know if someone is being truthful during debriefings, these kinds of capabilities become essential. And when you're dealing with someone like Karen, who's been making increasingly wild claims, having technology that can literally detect deception is like having a superpower. Officers, about 20 minutes before you arrived, I recorded a phone conversation between Miss Mitchell and what appears to be her business partner, I said, pulling up the relevant files on my main monitor. I think you'll find it quite revealing regarding the true nature of what's happening here. Officer Johnson leaned forward with obvious interest, while Officer Williams pulled out his notebook, apparently ready to document whatever we were about to hear. I clicked play, and Karen's voice filled the room with a crystal-clear quality that made it sound like she was standing right next to us. "Mark, just keep setting up. This neighbor guy can't do anything to stop us. I already told you I forged the HOA authorization myself. This $2 million contract is too important to let some antisocial hermit ruin it for us." The officers exchanged glances as Karen's recorded voice continued with obvious enthusiasm. "These investors are idiots anyway. All you have to do is mention blockchain wilderness experience, and they throw $50,000 at you like it's pocket change. We just need to keep this charade running for 4 hours, get the marketing videos we need, and we'll be set for life." But the recording wasn't finished. Karen's voice kept going, and what came next made Officer Williams stop writing and just stare at the speakers. The best part is that we don't even need real wilderness sounds. We're using the fake bird calls and nature audio from those speakers we planted around the property. These tech billionaires will think they're experiencing some kind of authentic Amazon rainforest when they're really just listening to a playlist I downloaded from YouTube. By the time they figure out they've been scammed, we'll be long gone with their money. The silence in the room after the recording ended was deafening. Officer Johnson was the first to speak, and his tone had shifted from professional courtesy to something much more serious. "Miss Morrison, do you have any more recordings from this morning?" I nodded and pulled up another file. This one was recorded about 15 minutes later when Miss Mitchell was giving instructions to her crew. The second recording was even more damning than the first, if that was possible. Karen's voice was giving detailed instructions about how to sell the experience and keep the marks happy while discussing contingency plans for if anyone gets suspicious. The key is to make them feel like they're part of something exclusive and revolutionary, Karen's recorded voice explained. These venture capitalists and tech executives have more money than sense. They're so desperate to be the first investors in the next big thing that they'll believe anything if you package it right. We just need to keep them busy with the VR headsets and fake wilderness sounds until we can get all the testimonial videos we need for our marketing campaign. Officer Johnson turned toward me with an expression that suggested he just witnessed something significantly more serious than a neighbor dispute. Mr. Morrison, are you willing to provide these recordings as evidence in a potential criminal investigation? Before I could answer, we heard Karen's voice from outside, much louder and more panicked than before. Officers, you need to come out here right now. Some of my guests are asking questions and I need your help managing the situation. Officer. Williams looked out the window and his eyebrows shot up. It looks like some of those VIP guests are having what you might call a heated discussion with Miss Mitchell. Through the window, I could see several of the expensive suit-wearing investors gathered around Karen in what appeared to be an increasingly aggressive confrontation. One of them, a tall man with the kind of bearing that screamed corporate executive, was waving what looked like a contract while pointing accusingly at Karen. Officers, I think Miss Mitchell's business model might be experiencing some unexpected complications, I said, with what I hoped was an appropriate level of understatement. Would you like to go see what's happening, or should we continue reviewing the audio evidence first? Officer Johnson was already heading toward the door. I think we'd better get out there before this situation escalates further. But, Mr. Morrison, we're definitely going to need copies of all those recordings. As we stepped back outside, the scene that greeted us looked like the beginning of a very expensive riot. The scene outside my cabin looked like something out of a corporate nightmare. What had started as an exclusive gathering of wealthy investors had devolved into something resembling an angry shareholders meeting, except everyone was standing in my front yard and several people were shouting about getting their lawyers on the phone. At the center of the chaos was Marcus Bloomberg, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than most people's cars and whose bearings suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. He was holding what appeared to be a signed contract, while pointing an accusatory finger at Karen, and his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that comes from realizing you've been made a fool of by someone you considered beneath your notice. Miss Mitchell? I want you to explain to me right now how you justified charging $50,000 per person for what appears to be an elaborate fraud. Bloomberg's voice had that particular edge that suggested he'd built his fortune by not tolerating people who tried to deceive him. My assistant overheard your phone conversation through an open window, and what we heard was you admitting to forging authorization documents and planning to scam everyone here with fake wilderness sounds. The crowd of other investors began murmuring among themselves, and I could see phones coming out as people started making what were probably very expensive phone calls to very powerful legal teams. Karen looked like a deer caught in headlights, but she was still trying to maintain her facade of authority and legitimacy. Mr. Bloomberg, there's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. Everything here is completely legitimate and properly authorized. Your assistant must have misheard something out of context. But her voice had lost that commanding tone she'd been using all morning, and I could see sweat starting to form on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. The confidence that had carried her through the confrontation with me and the initial police interaction was cracking under the pressure of facing 100 angry millionaires who were realizing they'd been played. Officer Johnson stepped forward with the kind of authoritative presence that suggested he dealt with similar situations before, though probably not involving quite this much money or this many influential people. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could, have your attention, please. We're currently investigating some irregularities with this event, and we're going to need everyone to remain calm while we sort out what's happening here. But calm was clearly not on the agenda for Bloomberg, who turned toward the officers with the expectation of immediate action that comes from being used to having law enforcement treat you as a priority. Officers, I want to report a fraud in progress, Bloomberg announced, pulling out what looked like a very expensive phone. My legal team is already reviewing the contracts we signed, and if what we overheard is true, this woman has stolen $50,000 from each of the 100 people here. That's $5 million in theft, and I want her arrested immediately. The crowd of investors began nodding in agreement, and several more people started making phone calls. I could hear fragments of conversations that included phrases like securities, fraud, criminal enterprise, and emergency injunction. This was the moment I realized that Karen had picked the wrong people to scam. These weren't just wealthy individuals who could afford to lose $50,000 and chalk it up to experience. These were the kind of people who built their fortunes by being smarter and more aggressive than everyone else in the room. They were venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and tech executives who'd gotten rich by identifying opportunities and threats faster than their competition. And right now, they'd identified Karen as a threat to both their money and their reputations. That's when I made a decision that would turn this entire situation from a criminal investigation into a public spectacle. Officers, if it would help your investigation, I have a high-quality audio system that could play the recordings for everyone to hear. That way, there wouldn't be any questions about what was actually said. Officer Williams looked at me with surprise, while Officer Johnson seemed to consider the implications of making the evidence public in real time. Mr. Morrison, that's unusual, but given the circumstances and the number of potential victims involved, it might actually be helpful for everyone to hear the evidence simultaneously. Karen's face went from worried to absolutely panicked. You can't do that. Those recordings are private conversations. This is entrapment or invasion of privacy or something. But Bloomberg cut her off with the kind of cold efficiency that suggested he'd spent his career dealing with people trying to avoid accountability. Miss Mitchell, if those conversations were conducted on this gentleman's private property without his consent, then you're the one who violated privacy laws. And if you've committed fraud against 100 people, then we all have a right to hear the evidence. I went back into my cabin and returned with my portable studio monitor system, the kind of professional equipment that delivers crystal-clear audio reproduction at high volumes. As I set up the speakers, I could see more cars arriving in the distance. Word was apparently spreading about what was happening, and it looked like some of the neighbors were coming to see what all the commotion was about. Mrs. Smith from down the street was walking over with her usual morning coffee cup and the Wilson. Family had emerged from their house to stand on their front porch. Even some people I didn't recognize were stopping their cars to see what was happening. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, feeling a bit like a DJ about to drop the beat of the century. I present to you the unedited recordings of Miss Mitchell's private conversations from this morning. The crowd fell silent as I hit play, and Karen's voice filled the air with the same crystal clarity that had impressed the officers inside me cabin. But hearing it played back through professional speakers for an audience of 100 scammed investors created a completely different dynamic. This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was public humiliation on a scale that Karen clearly hadn't anticipated. Mark, just keep setting up. This neighbor guy can't do anything to stop us. I already told you I forged the HOA authorization myself. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and intense. I heard gasps, several angry shouts, and what sounded like at least 3 people simultaneously dialing their phones. Bloomberg's face had gone from angry to absolutely livid, and he was now talking rapidly into his phone in what sounded like legal terminology mixed with some very creative profanity. But the recording kept playing, and as Karen's voice continued describing her plans to scam tech billionaires and idiots with more money than sense, the crowd's reaction grew more intense. Someone started slow clapping sarcastically. Another person shouted, "50,000 for YouTube bird sounds." And then something magical happened. The neighbors who'd been gathering to watch the spectacle started laughing and cheering. Mrs. Smith actually raised her coffee cup in what appeared to be a toast, and I heard someone yell. Finally, someone showing Karen's true colors. What happened? Next was like watching social media come to life in real time. As Karen's recorded voice continued playing through my professional audio system, admitting tow fraud and calling her victims idiots with more money than sense, someone in the crowd started live streaming the entire spectacle. Within minutes, I could see phones everywhere, pointed not just at Karen, but at the speakers broadcasting her confession to the world. The Muchars Karen scam exposed was probably trending before the recording even finished playing. But the real magic happened when I realized that this wasn't just about exposing Karen's fraud anymore. This had become the neighborhood's long-awaited moment of vindication against someone who had been terrorizing the community for months. Mrs. Smith was the first neighbor to really join the party. And when an 85-year-old woman starts heckling someone, you know things have reached a whole new level. "Karen Mitchell," she shouted, her voice carrying surprising strength for someone her age. "You fined me $500 for planting sunflowers because they were non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. And now we find out you've been forging HOA documents this whole time." The crowd of investors turned to look at Mrs. Smith with a combination of amusement and newfound respect. Here was someone who'd been dealing with Karen's tyranny long before any of them had heard her name. The Wilson family emerged from their house, and Mr. Wilson was carrying what appeared to be a stack of papers. "Officers," he called out, waving, the documents above his head. "I've got every bogus fine and citation this woman has issued over the past year. She made us repaint our entire house from yellow to beige because she claimed it violated HOA color guidelines that don't actually exist." Mrs. Wilson nodded emphatically and added, "She threatened to put a lien on our house if we didn't comply. We spent $3,000 on paint because we were terrified of losing our home. But the real revelation came when a black SUV pulled up and a man in an expensive suit stepped out with the kind of official bearing that suggested he was used to handling serious legal matters. He approached Officer Johnson with a badge that I couldn't quite see, but whatever it said made the officer's posture change immediately to something much more deferential. "I'm Detective Murphy from the Economic Crimes Unit," the newcomer announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've been monitoring some irregularities with HOA activities in this area, and it appears we've arrived at a very opportune time." Detective Murphy's presence seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the situation. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute or even a simple fraud case anymore. This was looking like the kind of organized criminal investigation that makes headlines and ruins lives. Miss Mitchell Murphy continued, approaching Karen with the measured pace of someone who's arrested people before. "We've received multiple complaints about your HOA activities over the past 6 months. Complaints about forged documents, unauthorized fines, and what appears to be an organized scheme to extract money from residents through fabricated violations." Karen's face went from panicked to absolutely desperate. "That's ridiculous. I am the legally elected president of this HOA, and I have full authority to enforce community standards. These people are just angry because I hold them accountable for maintaining property values." But her protest sounded increasingly hollow, especially with her own recorded voice still echoing from earlier admissions of document forgery and fraud. Detective Murphy pulled out a folder that looked uncomfortably thick and official. "Actually, Miss Mitchell, that's where you're wrong," Murphy said, opening the folder with what appeared to be practiced efficiency. "According to our investigation, you were removed from your position as HOA president 6 months ago following a community vote of no confidence. Since then, you've been operating without any legal authority whatsoever." He held up what looked like official court documents. "These are thorough HOA board meeting minutes filed with the county clerk's office. The vote to remove you was unanimous among actual board members." The revelation that Karen had been playing pretend dictator for 6 months without any real authority sent a visible shockwave through both the crowd of investors and the gathering neighbors. Bloomberg's expression shifted from angry to something approaching amazement. "Are you telling me that this woman has been running an elaborate con game on her entire neighborhood while simultaneously trying to defraud 100 business executives?" Detective Murphy nodded grimly. That appears to be exactly what's been happening here. But Murphy wasn't finished. Miss Mitchell, we also have evidence that you've been using your fraudulent HOA position to run multiple scam operations. The Wilderness VR event appears to be just the latest in a series of schemes designed to extract money from both residents and outside investors. He pulled out what looked like bank statements and financial documents. We've traced payments from at least 12 other fake events over the past 6 months, totaling over $800,000 in fraudulent revenue. The crowd was getting bigger by the minute. Word had spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a high school reunion, and people were arriving from all directions to witness Karen's public downfall. Someone had set up folding chairs, and I swear I saw Mrs. Patterson from 3 streets over carrying a bowl of popcorn. This wasn't just a criminal investigation anymore. This was turning into the community event of the year with Karen as the unwilling star of her own public disgrace. That's when I decided to take things to the next level. Detective Murphy, would it be helpful if I provided additional audio documentation of today's events? I have recordings of Miss Mitchell making threats, admitting to document forgery, and discussing her plans to defraud these investors. Murphy's eyes lit up with the expression of someone who'd just been handed exactly the evidence they needed to close a case. Mr. Morrison, that would be extremely helpful for our investigation. I connected my recording system to the large Bluetooth speaker I used for outdoor projects, the kind of setup that could easily fill a concert venue with sound. Ladies and gentlemen, neighbors and visitors, I announced with what I hoped was appropriate dramatic flair. I present to you the complete audio documentation of Karen Mitchell's attempted fraud, recorded this morning on high-quality surveillance equipment. As I hit play, Karen's voice once again filled the air. But this time it was being broadcast to what looked like half the neighborhood. The reaction was everything I could have hoped for and more. As Karen's recorded voice described her plans to scam tech billionaires and use fake bird sounds from YouTube, the crowd began responding like they were watching the world's most satisfying movie. People were cheering, laughing, and providing running commentary. Someone started a slow clap every time Karen said something particularly incriminating. Mrs. Smith raised her coffee cup in repeated toasts to justice finally being served. But the real climax came when Karen's recorded voice reached the part where she described the investors as having more money than sense and bragged about how easy it was to fool them with fake wilderness sounds. Bloomberg looked around at his fellow investors, and I could see something dangerous forming in his expression. This wasn't just about getting their money back anymore. This was about being publicly humiliated by someone they now realized had been laughing at them from the very beginning. Detective Murphy, Bloomberg said with the kind of cold precision that suggested he was used to destroying people who crossed him. I want every legal option pursued. Criminal charges, civil suits, asset seizure, everything. The other investors began, nodding in agreement, and several more were already on phones with what were obviously very expensive legal teams. Karen was standing in the middle of what had essentially become a public trial with 100 angry millionaires, a growing crowd of vindicated neighbors, and law enforcement officers who now had enough evidence to build multiple criminal cases. That's when Detective Murphy dropped the bombshell that would change everything. Actually, there's one more thing everyone should know about the jurisdiction issues here. Detective Murphy's bombshell hit like a legal nuclear weapon. What everyone needs to understand is that this property isn't just privately owned land, he announced, pulling out what appeared to be federal documentation. Mr. Morrison's cabin is located adjacent to a federally protected National Wildlife Sound Sanctuary, established under the Acoustic Environment Protection Act to preserve natural sound environments for endangered migratory species. The crowd fell silent as the implications of what he was saying began to sink in. Karen's face went from desperate to absolutely horrified as she realized that her fraud scheme had just crossed from state-level criminal charges into federal territory. The event that Miss Mitchell organized here today with amplified sound systems, large, Crowds and electronic equipment has violated federal environmental protection laws designed to protect critical habitat areas, Murphy continued, consulting his official documents. The penalty for commercial activities that disrupt protected acoustic environments can include fines up to $10 million and prison sentences of up to 15 years. Bloomberg and his fellow investors exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand just how thoroughly Karen had destroyed her own life with this scheme. But Murphy wasn't finished delivering the bad news. "Mr. Morrison, would you like to explain your official role in monitoring this protected area?" He stepped forward, feeling like the final piece of a very satisfying puzzle was about to click into place. "I'm an official contractor with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, conducting ongoing research on acoustic pollution impacts and wildlife behavior. My cabin and equipment serve as a monitoring station for federal environmental protection enforcement." The crowd was now staring at me with a mixture of amazement and newfound respect, while Karen looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Every sound, every conversation, and every piece of equipment that Mitchell brought onto this property has been automatically recorded and analyzed by federal environmental monitoring systems, I continued, gesturing toward my cabin. The noise levels from her event exceeded federal protection standards by over 300%, and we have complete digital documentation of the violation. Karen tried one last desperate protest, but I didn't know. No one told me this was a protected area. Murphy shook his head with the patience of someone who'd heard similar excuses many times before. "Ignorance of federal law isn't a defense, Miss Mitchell. And according to our investigation, you've been operating fraudulent schemes in this area for months, which suggests a pattern of willful disregard for legal requirements." He signaled to two other officers who had apparently arrived while everyone was focused on the recordings. "Karen Mitchell, you're under arrest for federal fraud, forgery of official documents, violation of environmental protection laws, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Karen's expression shifted through the entire spectrum from disbelief to rage to something approaching acceptance of her fate. Bloomberg stepped forward as Karen was being led toward the police car, and his voice carried the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from watching justice being served to someone who tried to make you look foolish. "Miss Mitchell, I want you to understand exactly what's going to happen to you now. My legal team will be filing civil suits for fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and damage to our business reputations. We're seeking full recovery of the $5 million you stole, plus punitive damages that could easily reach $50 million or more." Karen's legs seemed to give out slightly, and the officers had to support her as the full scope of her situation became clear. But the neighborhood's reaction was the real payoff for me. Mrs. Smith started a slow clap that gradually built into thunderous applause from the entire crowd. Finally, she shouted with obvious joy. Finally, someone stood up to this bully and showed everyone what she really was. The Wilson family was hugging each other like they'd just been freed from prison, and people throughout the crowd were sharing stories about Karen's previous abuses of power and expressing amazement that someone had finally held her accountable. As the police cars pulled away with Karen in custody, Detective Murphy handed me his business card. "Mr. Morrison, the federal prosecutors are going to want to work closely with you on this case. Your audio evidence and environmental monitoring data are going to be crucial for securing convictions on the federal charges." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced since my military days. For the first time in years, I'd used my skills and training to protect people, instead of just hiding from conflict. 3 months later, I was sitting in my cabin, enjoying the perfect quiet that had returned to my lakeside sanctuary, when my email chimed with 2 messages that brought a smile to my face. The first was from Netflix offering to purchase the rights to my story for a limited series they wanted to call The Sound of Justice: How Audio Technology Exposed the Ultimate Karen. The proposed deal included enough money to fund my research for the next decade and came with a guarantee that the story would be told accurately and respectfully. The second email was from Marcus Bloomberg, himself containing a business proposal that took me completely by surprise, Mr. Morrison. It read, "After witnessing your audio surveillance capabilities firsthand, my investment firm would like to discuss funding a commercial venture around your acoustic monitoring technology. We believe there's a significant market for consumer-grade audio security systems, and we'd like to offer $50 million in startup capital for the right partnership agreement." I leaned back in my chair and laughed, realizing that Karen's attempted scam had inadvertently launched my career into an entirely new direction. The final update on Karen's situation came through Detective Murphy, who called to let me know that she'd been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, ordered to pay full restitution to all her victims, and permanently banned from any HOA or community organization activities. The total financial damages, including criminal fines, civil judgments, and legal costs, exceeded $75 million, effectively guaranteeing that she'd never financially recover from her schemes. As I finished writing my reply to Bloomberg's investment offer, I realized that sometimes karma doesn't just serve justice, it serves it with interest and a side of poetic irony. Karen had tried to use my property to scam rich people out of millions of dollars, and in the process, she'd accidentally made me rich while destroying herself completely. The quiet I'd been seeking had returned. But now it came with the knowledge that sometimes standing up to bullies doesn't just protect yourself, it protects everyone around you. In the end, the neighborhood learned that HOA boards exist to serve residents, not to enable wannabe dictators. And I learned that technology, when used wisely, can be the great equalizer between ordinary people and those who abuse power. Karen had gambled everything on one last big score, and she'd lost it all to someone who simply refused to be intimidated. Justice, as it turns out, really does have the most beautiful sound of all. Well, that certainly didn't go as planned, did it? I thought I had everything figured out with my little VR wilderness scheme, but apparently Jack Morrison had other ideas. And those recording devices of his absolutely devastating to my carefully laid plans. If you enjoyed watching my spectacular downfall and want to hear more stories about people getting their comeuppance in the most unexpected ways, give Happer Stories a like and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for the next tale of karma striking.